Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the grave. And sometimes it takes a loyal dog to remind us that some secrets are too heavy for one man to carry alone. Up in the backwoods near Silver Ridge, Hank Cartwright lived quiet with just his dog Buster for company. One evening, Buster started barking at what looked like an ant nest by the shed. The mound had twisted roots and smelled like old blood. Hank ignored it until Buster wouldn't stop. 3 days of snarling like the devil was inside. When Hank finally dug it open, he found bones and a rusted badge. But whose badge was it, and why had someone buried it so deep? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of ponderosa pines that surrounded Hank Cartwright's cabin, like ancient sentinels keeping watch over secrets best left undisturbed. At 53, Hank had grown comfortable with solitude, finding peace in the rhythm of mountain life that asked nothing of him except survival. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of hard work and harder choices, wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee as he stood on the sagging porch that faced east toward the valley below. Buster, a mixed breed with the intelligence of a border collie and the loyalty of a saint, sat at Hank's feet, his amber eyes scanning the tree line with the vigilance of a creature who understood that safety was never guaranteed. The dog had wandered up to the cabin 3 winters ago, half-starved and bearing the marks of a hard life, much like his eventual master. Neither had asked questions of the other. Sometimes the best partnerships were built on mutual understanding rather than explanations. The cabin itself told the story of a man who had chosen function over form, necessity over comfort. Built from local timber with his own hands over the course of 2 summers, it stood solid against the mountain weather, but bore no ornamental touches that might suggest vanity or hope for visitors. A single room served as kitchen, living area and bedroom, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and shelves lined with practical books, wilderness survival, basic medicine, mechanical repair. A small woodshed attached to the north side held his tools and enough split pine to last through the harsh winters that could isolate the mountain for months. Behind the main structure, separated by about 50 yards of cleared ground, stood a smaller outbuilding that served as storage for hunting gear, emergency supplies, and the few possessions Hank had carried with him when he'd fled civilization 15 years earlier. It was near this shed that Buster had made his disturbing discovery, in a spot where wild raspberry bushes had grown thick enough to hide what lay beneath. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles down a winding dirt road that became impassable during heavy rains or winter snows. This isolation suited Hank perfectly. It meant that his business remained his own, his past stayed buried, and the demons that chased him through sleepless nights couldn't find an audience for their accusations. Every 2 weeks, when supplies ran low or the walls of the cabin seemed to press too close, Hank would make the journey down to Silver Ridge proper, a town that had seen better days but stubbornly refused to surrender to the economic realities that had claimed so many mountain communities. Main Street consisted of a general store, a small medical clinic, a bar called the Prospector's Rest, and a handful of other businesses that served the scattered population of ranchers, retirees, and refugees from modern life who had made the high country their home. Martha Henley ran the general store with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to read people as carefully as she read her ledgers. In her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing, she had become the unofficial keeper of community news and guardian of community secrets. She knew that Hank paid in cash, bought in bulk, and never lingered for conversation, but she also knew the signs of a man carrying weight that had nothing to do with the supplies in his backpack. "Morning." "Hank?" she would say when he appeared at her counter, her tone carefully neutral, offering neither judgment nor pity. "The usual?" The usual consisted of coffee, canned goods, flour, salt, ammunition for his hunting rifle, and a bottle of whiskey that he told himself was for medicinal purposes, but knew served a different kind of healing entirely. Martha never commented on the frequency of the whiskey purchases or the way Hank's hands sometimes trembled when he counted out the bills. In a community where everyone had fled from something, asking too many questions was considered poor manners. Dr. Robert Henderson, who ran the medical clinic with the dedication of a man who had taken his oath seriously, had treated Hank twice over the years, once for a nasty cut from a poorly handled axe, and once for what he diplomatically called exhaustion, but recognized as the physical toll of sustained alcohol abuse. Both times Hank had paid in cash, answered questions with minimal responses, and left as soon as medically advisable. Dr. Henderson, a man in his 70s who had seen his share of broken souls seeking healing in the mountains, understood that some patients required more than medicine. The closest thing Hank had to regular human contact came in the form of brief encounters with these two pillars of the Silver Ridge community, interactions that served as lifelines to a world he had chosen to abandon but could never fully escape. They represented the thin thread that kept him tethered to humanity, even as he did his best to sever all other connections. His daily routine had evolved over the years into a careful balance of physical labor, mental discipline, and chemical escape. Mornings belonged to maintenance, chopping wood, checking traps, repairing whatever the mountain weather had damaged during the night. The physical work helped quiet the voices in his head, the memories that surfaced without warning to remind him of choices made and prices paid. Afternoons were for hunting or foraging, depending on the season and his needs. The mountains provided well for those who understood their rhythms and respected their dangers. Hank had learned to read the signs that predicted weather changes, to identify the plants that could nourish or heal, and to move through the forest with the silent efficiency of a predator who had become prey in another life. Evenings belonged to the bottle and the fire, to the careful process of numbing the edges of memory until sleep became possible. The whiskey helped blur the faces that haunted his dreams, helped silence the accusations that echoed in the mountain silence. It was a temporary solution to a permanent problem, but temporary was all he asked for anymore. Buster had changed this routine in subtle but significant ways. The dog's presence provided a reason to maintain schedules, to ensure that food and water were available, to consider the welfare of another living creature. It had been years since Hank had been responsible for anything beyond his own survival, and the weight of that responsibility felt both foreign and oddly comforting. The dog had also brought a kind of early warning system to the isolated cabin. Buster's hearing exceeded human capabilities, and his instincts had been honed by whatever experiences had shaped him before their paths crossed. When visitors approached, the rare hiker who had wandered off marked trails, the occasional hunter who had ventured too far from designated areas, Buster's subtle alerts gave Hank time to prepare, to decide whether to make himself known or to fade into the forest until the intrusion passed. But Buster's behavior over the past 3 days had been different, more urgent and specific than his usual vigilance. The dog had focused his attention on a particular spot near the storage shed, a mound of earth that appeared unremarkable but had triggered some deep recognition in the animal's consciousness. The barking had started low and persistent, escalating to an almost frantic intensity that suggested more than curiosity. It suggested recognition of something that shouldn't be there. Hank had initially dismissed the behavior as reaction to some burrowing animal or unusual scent carried by the mountain winds. Animals could be unpredictable, and Buster had never displayed this level of obsession with any particular location. But as the barking continued through 3 days and nights, accompanied by pawing at the earth and refusing to be distracted by food or commands, Hank had begun to suspect that his companion had discovered something significant. The mound itself appeared natural at first glance, a slight rise in the earth covered by wild raspberry bushes that had grown thick and tangled over what must have been several seasons. But closer inspection revealed irregularities that suggested human intervention. The soil was a different color than the surrounding earth, darker and richer, as if it had been turned and mixed with organic matter. The twisted roots that protruded from the surface seemed to follow no natural pattern. And there was indeed an underlying odor that reminded Hank of old metal, and something else he preferred not to identify. Standing on his porch that morning, watching Buster resume his vigil near the mysterious mound, Hank felt the familiar weight of dread settling in his chest. In his experience, buried things stayed buried for good reasons, and disturbing them rarely led to anything but trouble. He had spent 15 years building a life based on avoiding trouble, on keeping his head down and his past buried as deeply as whatever lay beneath those raspberry bushes. But Buster's persistence suggested that avoidance might no longer be an option. The dog possessed an intuition that Hank had learned to respect, and that intuition was telling them both that some secrets were too dangerous to ignore. As he finished his coffee and prepared to face another day in the mountains he had chosen as his refuge, Hank found himself wondering if his carefully constructed isolation was about to be shattered by whatever truth lay buried in his own backyard. The morning sun climbed higher through the pine branches, casting shifting shadows across the clearing where man and dog contemplated the earth that held its secrets close. Neither could have predicted that the simple act of digging would uncover not just bones and metal, but a chain of events that would force Hank to confront the very past he had spent 15 years trying to forget. In the distance, a hawk circled on thermal currents, its cry echoing across the valley like a warning that change was coming whether he welcomed it or not. The decision came to Hank not as a moment of courage, but as a surrender to the inevitable. Buster's fourth consecutive night of restless barking had robbed him of what little peace his whiskey-aided sleep usually provided, and the dog's growing agitation suggested that ignoring the problem would only make it worse. The morning air carried a chill that spoke of autumn's approach, and Hank found himself standing over the mysterious mound with a shovel in his hands and resignation in his heart. "All right, boy," he murmured to Buster, who sat at attention beside him, tail rigid with anticipation. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." The first few shovelfuls revealed nothing more than dark earth mixed with decomposed organic matter, the kind of rich soil that supported the wild raspberry bushes that had claimed this corner of his property. But as Hank dug deeper, the earth began to tell a different story. The soil changed color and consistency, becoming more clay-like and bearing the unmistakable signs of having been disturbed and packed down by human hands. At 18 inches deep, his shovel struck something solid with a hollow metallic ring that made both man and dog freeze. Buster whined low in his throat, a sound that carried both anticipation and warning. Hank set aside the shovel and dropped to his knees, using his hands to carefully brush away the remaining earth. What emerged from the dark soil made his stomach clench with recognition and dread. The yellowed bones of a human hand, still bearing the tarnished remains of what had once been a wedding ring. But it was the object clutched in those skeletal fingers that sent ice through Hank's veins. A six-pointed star made of tarnished metal, the unmistakable shape of a sheriff's badge. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Hank remained frozen on his knees beside the grave, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him. The badge was old, its surface green with age and corrosion, but the shape was unmistakable. More importantly, the style and design triggered memories that he had spent 15 years trying to drown in whiskey and isolation. Buster moved closer, his nose working the air above the exposed remains. But his earlier agitation had been replaced by a solemn calm, as if the discovery had satisfied some deep need for truth. The dog settled beside Hank, offering silent companionship as his master stared into a grave that held more than bones. With trembling hands, Hank carefully extracted the badge from the skeletal grasp, noting how the metal felt heavier than it should have. weighted with significance beyond its physical properties. The surface bore scratches and dents that spoke of years of wear, and though the tarnish obscured most details, he could make out partial letters that formed a name, Coleman. The name hit him like a physical blow, unleashing a flood of memories that crashed through the mental barriers he had spent years constructing. Sheriff Tom Coleman, a man who had believed in justice with the fervor of a true believer, who had mentored a young deputy named Hank Cartwright in the ways of law enforcement, and who had disappeared without a trace during a corruption investigation that had shaken Silver Ridge County to its foundations. Hank's hand shook as he turned the badge over, examining every detail as if it might provide answers to questions he was afraid to ask. The memories came in fragments, Coleman's weathered face, serious and determined as he explained the importance of honor in law enforcement. Heated discussions in the sheriff's office about missing evidence and suspicious coincidences. The growing tension in the department as Coleman's investigation uncovered uncomfortable truths about local power structures. And then, nothing. A black void where his memories should have been. A gap that coincided with Coleman's disappearance and Hank's own sudden departure from law enforcement. The missing weeks haunted him like a phantom limb, aching with the weight of something important that his mind refused to remember. Buster's sudden alertness brought Hank back to the present. The dog's ears were pricked forward, his body tense with the awareness of approaching danger. Through the trees, Hank could hear the distant sound of an engine making its way up the rough mountain road. A visitor, which was unusual enough to be cause for concern. Quickly, Hank reburied the skeletal remains, covering them with loose earth and arranging the raspberry bushes to obscure any signs of disturbance. The badge, however, he slipped into his jacket pocket, its weight pressing against his chest like an accusation. Whatever vehicle was approaching, he had no intention of explaining what he had discovered to anyone until he better understood what it meant. The engine noise grew louder, revealing itself to be a late-model SUV that was struggling with the rough terrain but making steady progress toward his cabin. Hank moved to his porch, Buster at his side, both of them watching as the vehicle emerged from the tree line and pulled up near his front steps. The man who stepped out of the SUV was everything Hank was not: polished, confident and expensively dressed in a way that suggested success in endeavors that generated substantial income. Vincent Shaw appeared to be in his early 40s, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of regular gym memberships and professional grooming. His smile was practiced and predatory as he approached the porch. "Mr. Cartwright?" "Vincent Shaw. I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit, but I wanted to discuss a business opportunity that might interest you." Hank remained silent, his hand resting on Buster's head as the dog growled low in his throat. Something about Shaw triggered every instinct that had kept Hank alive through years of dangerous situations. Though he couldn't identify the specific source of the threat, Shaw seemed unbothered by the cool reception, pulling out a folder from his SUV and approaching the porch with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I represent a development company that's interested in acquiring property in this area for a luxury mountain resort. Your land would be perfect for our needs, and I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer." The conversation that followed felt like a chess match between players with hidden agendas. Shaw's offer was indeed generous, more money than Hank had seen in years, but the timing felt suspicious. The man's questions about the property seemed to focus on the area near the storage shed, and his casual inquiries about Hank's knowledge of local history carried undertones that suggested more than casual interest. As Shaw spoke, Hank found himself studying the man's features, searching for some connection to the memories that the badge had stirred. There was something familiar about the eyes, the way Shaw carried himself, but the recognition remained frustratingly elusive, like trying to grasp smoke. "I'll need time to consider your offer," Hank said finally, his voice giving nothing away. Shaw's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Of course, But I should mention that this opportunity won't remain available indefinitely. Sometimes circumstances change in ways that make previous arrangements impossible. The veiled threat hung in the air between them as Shaw returned to his SUV and drove away, leaving Hank and Buster alone, with questions that multiplied like shadows as the sun moved across the sky. The badge in Hank's pocket seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy, a talisman that had awakened forces he was not prepared to face that evening. As Hank sat on his porch with a glass of whiskey and watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, he realized that his carefully constructed isolation had been shattered as completely as if Shaw had driven a bulldozer through his front door. The past had found him despite his best efforts to escape it, and the price of that discovery remained to be calculated. Buster lay at his feet, alert and watchful, as if he understood that their quiet life in the mountains had come to an end. The badge rested on the table between them, its tarnished surface reflecting the dying light like an accusation that could no longer be ignored. Tomorrow, Hank knew he would have to begin the process of uncovering truths that he had spent 15 years trying to forget. The alternative, accepting Shaw's offer and fleeing once again, felt like a betrayal of something larger than his own peace of mind. Coleman deserved better than to remain buried in an unmarked grave, and the badge demanded justice that only the truth could provide. As darkness settled over the mountains and the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Hank made a decision that would change everything. He would find out what had happened to Sheriff Tom Coleman, no matter what the cost to his own carefully constructed sanctuary. The past, it seemed, was no longer content to stay buried. Sleep had abandoned Hank entirely that night, leaving him to pace the confines of his cabin like a caged animal, while Buster watched with concerned eyes from his place by the dying fire. The badge sat on the rough-hewn table, catching occasional glints of firelight that made it seem alive with malevolent purpose. Every time Hank's gaze fell upon it, another fragment of memory would surface. Coleman's laugh, the way he took his coffee black with 2 sugars, the intensity in his eyes when he spoke about justice. By dawn, Hank had made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation he had cultivated over the past 15 years. He would search through his own belongings, the boxes and containers he had packed when he fled his old life and had never opened since arriving at the cabin. If answers existed about what had happened to Tom Coleman, they might be buried in his own past as surely as the sheriff's body had been buried in his backyard, the storage area. Beneath his cabin was access through a trapdoor that he had covered with a heavy rug and tried his best to forget. As he pried up the boards and descended into the cramped space below, the musty air carried scents that transported him instantly back to another time: gun oil, leather, and the faint residue of cologne he had worn when appearance mattered. 3 cardboard boxes sat in the dim space, their contents representing the last remnants of Deputy Hank Cartwright's professional life. With hands that trembled only slightly, he carried them up into the cabin's main room and spread their contents across his table, pushing Coleman's badge to one side as if to make room for its context. The first box contained official documents, certificates of training, commendations, and the various paperwork that accumulated over a decade of law enforcement service. Reading through them felt like examining the life of a stranger, a man who had believed in order and justice with the same fervor that had driven his mentor. Among these papers, he found what he had been looking for without knowing it: a hand-drawn map of Silver Ridge County that he had created during his early years as a deputy. The map was crude but detailed, marking not just official boundaries and landmarks, but also the informal territories that every lawman learned to recognize. Here was where the bootleggers operated. There was the canyon where stolen cattle were hidden. And scattered throughout were notations in his own handwriting about corruption, suspicious activities, and patterns that had troubled the young deputy's sense of justice. But it was the area around his current property that drew his attention with growing unease. The map showed his land as part of a larger parcel that had been the subject of some kind of dispute, marked with question marks and the notation Shaw Interests, verify ownership claims. The name Shaw felt like ice in his veins, confirming what he had suspected about Vincent's visit being more than coincidental. The second box held personal items that painted a picture of a different man entirely. Photographs showed a younger Hank in uniform, standing beside colleagues at department gatherings, his face open and confident in ways that seemed foreign now. One photo in particular made him pause, himself and Coleman at some kind of ceremony, both men smiling as the sheriff pinned a commendation to Hank's uniform. The pride in Coleman's expression was unmistakable, as was the genuine affection between mentor and student, but it was among these personal effects that Hank found the artifact that would change everything. A yellowed newspaper clipping that had been carefully folded and preserved, though he had no memory of saving it. The headline read, "Sheriff Coleman Missing Following Investigation into Land Fraud," and the article detailed the disappearance of Silver Ridge County's most respected lawman during his investigation into illegal land acquisitions and forged documents. Reading the article was like watching his own past unfold through a stranger's eyes. The reporter had interviewed several sources, including Deputy Hank Cartwright, who was reportedly the last person to see Sheriff Coleman before his disappearance. The quote attributed to him was formal and non-committal. Sheriff Coleman was investigating several ongoing cases. "We are confident he will return when his work is complete." The date on the newspaper was 23 years ago, 8 years before Hank had fled to the mountains. Yet he had no memory of the interview, no recollection of being questioned about Coleman's disappearance. The gap in his memory yawned like an abyss, and he found himself staring at the clipping as if it might provide answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Buster's low growl interrupted his reverie, alerting him to movement outside the cabin. Through the window, Hank could see a familiar figure approaching, Martha from the general store, moving with the determined gait of a woman on a mission. Her presence at his isolated cabin was unprecedented, and Hank quickly gathered the scattered documents and photos, shoving them back into their boxes before answering her knock. "Morning, Hank," Martha said when he opened the door, her sharp eyes taking in his disheveled appearance and the obvious signs of a sleepless night. "Thought I should mention that we had a visitor in town yesterday asking questions about you." The words confirmed Hank's growing paranoia about Shaw's true motives. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggested more than casual interest," Martha replied, accepting his invitation to sit at the table where Coleman's badge still lay partially concealed beneath a dish towel. "Vincent Shaw claims to be a developer, but he was asking about your background, how long you've been here, whether you ever talk about your past." Martha's presence in his cabin felt surreal, like two different worlds colliding in ways that couldn't be undone. She represented the tenuous connection he maintained with normal life, while the badge and documents spoke to a past that refused to remain buried. Her keen eyes missed nothing, and Hank realized that his carefully maintained facade of simple hermit was crumbling under scrutiny. "There's something else," Martha continued, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Shaw wasn't just asking about you. He was asking about Tom Coleman." The name hung between them like a challenge, and Hank felt the last of his defenses beginning to collapse. Martha's expression suggested that she knew more than she was saying, that his connection to the disappeared sheriff was no secret to those who remembered the old days. "Martha," Hank said finally, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of silence, "what do you remember about Coleman's disappearance?" Her answer would open doors that Hank had spent years trying to keep locked. But as he looked at the badge lying on his table and felt the weight of the newspaper clipping in his pocket, he realized that some doors could no longer be kept closed. The past was demanding its due, and Vincent Shaw's questions suggested that others were already ahead of him in seeking answers. The conversation that followed would mark the beginning of the end of Hank's isolation. though neither he nor Martha could have predicted the full cost of the truths they were about to uncover. Outside, Buster maintained his vigil, as if he understood that the safety of their mountain sanctuary now depended on facing dangers that had been buried for far too long. Martha's question about what he remembered regarding Coleman's disappearance hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, impossible to ignore and growing more suffocating with each passing moment. Hank found himself studying her weathered face, noting the way her eyes held knowledge that went beyond casual recollection. This was a woman who had lived through the events that haunted his fractured memory, and her presence in his cabin suggested that the time for secrets had passed. "I remember fragments," Hank admitted, his voice rough with the weight of confession. Coleman was investigating something big: land fraud, forged documents, people in positions of power who were getting rich off illegal schemes. "But there's a gap in my memory, Martha. Weeks where I can't recall what happened, starting right around the time he disappeared." Martha nodded slowly, as if his words confirmed suspicions she had harbored for years. "Tom Coleman was a good man who asked too many of the right questions. And you were his most trusted deputy, which made you either a valuable ally or a dangerous liability, depending on which side you were on." The implication in her words sent ice through Hank's veins. Which side was I on? Before Martha could answer, Buster's sharp bark from outside interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see the dog positioned near the burial site, his body language suggesting that something had disturbed the careful camouflage Hank had arranged that morning. With growing dread, Hank realized that his hasty concealment job might not have been as thorough as he had hoped. "Stay here," he told Martha, but she was already following him toward the door with the determination of a woman who had come too far to be left behind now. What they found at the burial site made Hank's stomach clench with a mixture of guilt and revelation. His morning excavation had been more thorough than he remembered, and the afternoon sun had dried the disturbed earth enough to reveal clear evidence of digging. But more importantly, his hasty reburial had failed to cover everything that lay beneath the surface. Protruding from the loose soil were additional bones and what appeared to be personal effects that had been buried with Coleman's body. Working together with hands that trembled from more than exertion, Hank and Martha carefully uncovered what amounted to a time capsule of the sheriff's final days. Sheriff Coleman's personal effects painted a picture of a man who had known he was in danger. His wallet, remarkably preserved in the dry mountain soil, contained not just identification, but also carefully folded papers that detailed his investigation. There were copies of forged land deeds, photographs of suspicious meetings, and most damning of all, a series of handwritten notes that revealed the scope of the corruption he had uncovered. But it was Coleman's watch that provided the most chilling revelation. The timepiece had stopped at 11:47, and scratched into its back surface were the initials HC, along with what appeared to be a date, the same date as the newspaper article Martha had found in town, marking the last day anyone had seen Tom Coleman alive. "He left this for you," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of understanding. "Tom knew what was going to happen to him, and he wanted to make sure you would find the evidence if something went wrong." The watch felt impossibly heavy in Hank's hands, its stopped face reflecting his own haunted expression. The initials carved into its surface suggested that Coleman had trusted his deputy completely, even in his final moments. But if that was true, what had happened to that trust? Why had Hank fled instead of pursuing justice for his murdered mentor? Among Coleman's effects, they found letters that revealed the personal cost of his investigation. Notes from his wife expressing concern about the threats they had been receiving, correspondence with state investigators about federal involvement in the case, and most heartbreaking of all, a letter addressed to Hank himself that had never been delivered. The letter was brief but devastating in its implications. "Hank, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. The corruption goes deeper than we thought, and there are people willing to kill to keep their secrets. Trust no one in the department except yourself. The evidence you need is hidden where we used to meet for coffee. Remember our talks about justice. Sometimes it comes at a price we're not prepared to pay. Take care of Mary for me." Martha's sharp intake of breath suggested that she recognized references that meant nothing to Hank's fractured memory. "Where did you and Tom meet for coffee?" The question should have had an obvious answer, but Hank found himself staring into another void where his memory should have been. The missing weeks in his recollection seemed to be expanding, swallowing not just events but entire relationships and routines that had once defined his life. "I don't remember," he admitted, the words tasting like failure. "There's so much I don't remember about that time." Martha studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Hank, what's the last thing you clearly remember from your time as a deputy?" The question forced him to examine the boundaries of his amnesia more carefully than he ever had before. Working backward from his arrival at the mountain cabin, he could trace his journey of escape and the decision to flee. But before that, nothing but fragments and impressions that felt more like dreams than memories. "I remember Coleman talking about the investigation, about how dangerous it was becoming. I remember being afraid, not for myself, but for him. And then," he spread his hands helplessly, "nothing until I was packing my things and running." The implications of his memory loss were becoming impossible to ignore. Someone had taken great care to ensure that Deputy Hank Cartwright's recollections of Tom Coleman's final days remained buried as deeply as the sheriff's body. The question was whether he had been a victim of that manipulation or a willing participant in covering up the truth. As the afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees and painted the burial site in golden light, Hank and Martha carefully reburied Coleman's effects, but not before documenting everything they had found. The watch, however, Hank kept, feeling the weight of its stop time against his palm, like a countdown to some inevitable reckoning. Vincent Shaw's visit was beginning to make terrible sense. The man wasn't just interested in acquiring land for development. He was trying to eliminate the last witness to whatever had happened to Tom Coleman 23 years ago. The question was whether Hank's testimony would be worth anything when he couldn't remember the events that needed witnessing. As they walked back toward the cabin, Martha's hand briefly touched his arm in a gesture of support that surprised him with its warmth. "We're going to figure this out, Hank. Tom Coleman deserves justice, and you deserve to know the truth about what happened to you." Her words carried a promise that felt both comforting and terrifying. The truth, when it finally emerged from the shadows of his memory, might prove to be more than either of them was prepared to handle. The trip to Silver Ridge the following morning felt like a pilgrimage to a past that Hank had tried to erase, but could no longer avoid. Martha rode beside him in his battered pickup truck, her presence both comforting and unsettling as they wound down the mountain road toward a town that held answers he wasn't sure he wanted to find. Buster sat alert in the truck bed, his ears pricked forward as if he too sensed that this journey would change everything. The Silver Ridge Public Library occupied a brick building that had seen better days, its facade weathered but dignified, like an old man who remembered when respect was earned rather than demanded. Inside, the familiar scent of aging paper and binding glue created an atmosphere of preserved knowledge, though Hank wondered if the secrets they sought had been deliberately excluded from them. Official record. Martha moved through the building with the confidence of someone who had spent years cultivating relationships with the keepers of local knowledge. The librarian, a woman named Eleanor who appeared to be roughly Martha's age, greeted them with the cautious warmth reserved for old friends bearing serious business. "Eleanor, we need to look at the newspaper archives from 23 years ago," Martha said without preamble. "Specifically, anything related to Tom Coleman's disappearance and the land fraud investigations." Eleanor's expression shifted from welcoming to wary, her eyes moving between Martha and Hank as if trying to gauge the nature of their interest. "That's a period that some folks prefer to keep buried, Martha. Are you sure you want to dig up old troubles?" "The troubles never got buried properly," Martha replied firmly. "They just got covered up, and now they're surfacing whether we want them to or not." The newspaper archives were stored on microfilm, a technology that seemed as antiquated as the secrets they hoped to uncover. As Eleanor threaded the film through the reader and adjusted the focus, grainy images of Silver Ridge's past began to flicker across the screen like scenes from a half-remembered dream. The first articles about Coleman's investigation painted a picture of a methodical lawman slowly unraveling a complex web of corruption. Headlines progressed from "Sheriff investigates land irregularities" to "Federal agents assist in fraud investigation" to "Missing documents, halt corruption probe." Reading the articles chronologically, Hank could see how the investigation had gained momentum before suddenly stalling. But it was the discovery of Coleman's badge book, a detailed record of arrests, investigations and observations that every sheriff was required to maintain, that provided the breakthrough they needed. The book had been donated to the library's historical collection after Coleman's disappearance. Apparently viewed as a harmless record of routine law enforcement activities, what they found within its pages was anything but routine. Coleman's meticulous handwriting documented a pattern of corruption that reached far beyond simple land fraud. Names appeared repeatedly: Vincent Shaw Sr., along with several other prominent local families, all involved in a scheme that involved buying property with forged documents, manipulating county records, and selling the land to developers at enormous profits. More disturbing were Coleman's notes about intimidation and threats directed at anyone who questioned the transactions. Several potential witnesses had suddenly left town or withdrawn their complaints after receiving visits from unnamed individuals. One entry, dated just weeks before Coleman's disappearance, was particularly chilling. Hank reports unusual pressure from department brass to drop investigation. "Someone is getting to our own people." The mention of his own name in Coleman's notes triggered a flash of memory that hit Hank like a physical blow. Suddenly he could see himself in the sheriff's office, arguing with Coleman about the dangers of continuing the investigation. But the memory felt strange, disconnected, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold. "I remember this conversation," he said quietly, his finger tracing Coleman's handwriting. "But I remember arguing the opposite position. I was the one pushing to continue the investigation, not the one under pressure to stop it." Martha and Eleanor exchanged glances that suggested they understood implications that remained unclear to Hank. "Memory can be tricky," Eleanor said carefully, "especially when someone has reasons to make sure you remember things differently than they actually happened." The suggestion that his memories had been deliberately altered was both terrifying and oddly liberating. If his recollections couldn't be trusted, then perhaps the guilt and shame that had driven him to the mountains were based on falsehoods rather than facts. But it also meant that everything he thought he knew about himself might be a carefully constructed lie. Further research revealed that the corruption investigation had died with Coleman's disappearance. The federal agents who had been assisting with the case were reassigned, key witnesses recanted their statements, and crucial evidence mysteriously vanished from the county courthouse. Within 6 months, it was as if the investigation had never existed. But Coleman's badge book contained one final revelation that made Hank's blood run cold. Hidden among routine entries about traffic citations and domestic disturbances was a carefully coded message that only someone familiar with police procedures would recognize. Using a system of case numbers and references that appeared random but followed a deliberate pattern, Coleman had documented meetings with federal agents, the location of hidden evidence caches, and most importantly, the identity of the person within the sheriff's department who was feeding information to the corruption ring. The name, when decoded, was Deputy Hank Cartwright. The revelation hit him like a punch to the solar plexus, leaving him gasping for breath as the implications crashed over him in waves. According to Coleman's most trusted records, Hank had been the inside source, the traitor who had betrayed the investigation and possibly led to his mentor's murder. But even as the evidence stared him in the face, something deep within him rebelled against the accusation. The fragments of memory he could access, the emotional responses that felt genuine even when the details remained elusive, all suggested a different truth. He had loved and respected Tom Coleman like a father. The idea that he would have betrayed that trust felt fundamentally wrong. "This doesn't make sense," he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Coleman trusted me enough to leave me his watch, to carve my initials in it as some kind of message. Why would he do that if I was the one who betrayed him?" Martha's hand found his shoulder, offering comfort and support, as he grappled with revelations that seemed to contradict everything he believed about himself. "Maybe," she said quietly, "the real question isn't whether you betrayed Tom Coleman. Maybe the question is whether someone made it look like you did, and whether Tom knew the difference." As they left the library, with photocopies of the most damning evidence, Hank felt the weight of 23 years pressing down on him like the mountain stones that marked forgotten graves. The truth was out there, buried as deeply as Coleman's body had been, and finding it would require him to dig through layers of deception that might destroy what little peace he had managed to build in his isolated refuge. But Coleman's watch ticked steadily in his pocket. It stopped time, a reminder that some debts could never be repaid until the truth was finally brought to light. The drive back to the cabin passed in heavy silence, both Hank and Martha lost in thoughts too complex for easy conversation. The photocopied documents from Coleman's badge book lay between them, on the truck's bench seat, like evidence in a trial where the accused couldn't remember the crime. Buster seemed to sense the tension, pressing his nose against the rear window as if offering what comfort he could to his troubled master. It wasn't until they were climbing the steep grade toward Hank's property that Martha finally spoke, her voice cutting through the engine noise with the precision of someone who had been carefully choosing her words. "There's something I haven't told you about the day Tom Coleman disappeared." Hank's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but he remained silent, sensing that whatever Martha was about to reveal would add another layer to the mystery that was consuming his carefully ordered world. "I was working late at the store that night, doing inventory," she continued, her gaze fixed on the pine trees that lined the mountain road. "Tom came by around 10 o'clock, looking like a man who'd seen his own ghost. He asked me to hold something for him, said if anything happened to him, I should make sure it got to the right person." The truck crested the final hill before Hank's cabin, but instead of feeling relief at returning to his sanctuary, he felt only growing dread about what other secrets his property might hold. "What did he give you?" "A manila envelope, sealed and marked with your name. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right time to give it to you." Martha's voice carried the weight of decades of uncertainty. "After you disappeared so suddenly, I wasn't sure if you were the right person anymore, or if giving it to you might put you in more danger." They pulled up to the cabin in a cloud of dust and silence, both of them staring at the building that had been Hank's refuge for 15 years, but now felt more like a prison built from his own ignorance. The idea that Coleman had left him a message, that Martha had been protecting it all this time, added new dimensions to guilt he was already struggling to bear. "Where is it now?" he asked. "Hidden in my store," Martha replied. Tom was very specific about the hiding place, said it was somewhere only someone who knew him well would think to look. The reference to hidden evidence caches triggered another fragment of memory, this one clearer than the others had been. Hank could suddenly see himself and Coleman in the sheriff's office, discussing contingency plans in case their investigation was compromised. Coleman had been paranoid about evidence being stolen or destroyed, insisting on multiple hiding places that only the two of them knew about. "The coffee shop," Hank said suddenly, the words emerging from some deep recess of his mind. "We used to meet at Millie's Diner every Tuesday morning before shift change. Coleman always sat in the same booth, the one by the window where he could watch the street." Martha's eyes widened with recognition. "Millie's burned down about 5 years after Tom disappeared. But before it did, I helped clean out the storage room. There was a loose floorboard under the coffee machine where someone had hidden a metal box. The conversation that followed revealed layers of preparation that spoke to Coleman's understanding of the danger he faced. Not only had he hidden evidence in multiple locations, but he had also created a network of trusted civilians who could preserve crucial information if the official channels were compromised. Martha had been one of those civilians, chosen not for her law enforcement connections, but for her reputation as someone who could keep secrets, and her position at the heart of the community's information network as they sat on Hank's porch, discussing Coleman's hidden evidence cache. Buster's sudden alertness drew their attention to movement in the tree line. A figure was approaching through the forest, moving with the careful stealth of someone who didn't want to be detected. Both Hank and Martha rose from their chairs, tension crackling between them as they realized their investigation had not gone unnoticed. The figure that emerged from the trees was Dr. Henderson, but his usual calm demeanor had been replaced by obvious agitation. His medical bag hung from his shoulder, and his clothes bore the signs of hasty travel through rough terrain. "I came the back way," he said without preamble, his eyes scanning the clearing as if checking for additional watchers. "Vincent Shaw paid me a visit this morning, asking very specific questions about your medical history. And questions about memory loss, trauma-induced amnesia, and whether certain medications could cause gaps in recollection." The doctor's words confirmed Hank's growing suspicions about the nature of his memory problems, but they also revealed a new level of threat. If Shaw was investigating the mechanisms of memory loss, it suggested he knew exactly what had been done to suppress Hank's recollections and was concerned about their potential return. "What did you tell him?" Martha asked. "Nothing useful," Dr. Henderson replied firmly, but his questions made it clear that he knows more about Hank's condition than any casual acquaintance should. He also made some veiled threats about the consequences of harboring fugitives or obstructing justice. The three of them stood in the afternoon sunlight, each grappling with the realization that their investigation had crossed a line that made them targets rather than seekers of truth. Shaw's interest in Hank's memory problems suggested that the corruption network Coleman had been investigating was still active, still powerful enough to eliminate threats to its continued operation. Dr. Henderson's medical expertise provided a new perspective on Hank's amnesia. "The selective nature of your memory loss suggests chemical intervention rather than natural trauma," he explained. "Certain drugs can create targeted amnesia, erasing specific time periods while leaving other memories intact. The process requires medical knowledge and careful dosing." The implications were staggering. Not only had someone murdered Tom Coleman and framed Hank for the betrayal, but they had also chemically altered his memory to ensure he couldn't expose the truth. The gaps in his recollection weren't the result of psychological trauma or alcohol abuse. They were evidence of a sophisticated cover-up that had stolen years of his life, along with his sense of identity. As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the clearing where they stood, the three unlikely allies realized they were facing an enemy that had already demonstrated its willingness to kill to protect its secrets. Coleman's evidence cache represented both their best hope for justice and their greatest danger. A truth so powerful that people had died to keep it buried. Martha's store, with its hidden envelope and secrets preserved across decades, had become the next battlefield in a war that had started 23 years ago and showed no signs of ending. The question was whether they had the courage to retrieve what Coleman had left for them. Knowing that doing so might cost them everything they had left to lose, Buster moved closer to Hank's side, his presence a reminder that loyalty and trust could survive even when memory failed. Whatever the hidden evidence revealed, whatever the cost of uncovering the truth, there was no longer any choice but to see the investigation through to its conclusion. The past had found them, and it demanded an accounting that could no longer be postponed. The decision to retrieve Coleman's hidden evidence couldn't wait for morning. Vincent Shaw's questions about memory loss treatments suggested that time was running out, that whatever protection Hank's amnesia had provided was rapidly deteriorating. As darkness settled over the mountains, the three unlikely allies made their way down the winding road toward Silver Ridge, their headlights cutting through shadows that seemed to harbor watching eyes. Martha's general store stood silent in the moonlight, its familiar facade taking on an ominous quality that made all of them pause before entering. The building that had been the heart of community commerce for decades now felt like a tomb containing secrets that had waited too long for resurrection. Martha's hand shook slightly as she unlocked the door, the sound of the deadbolt echoing in the mountain silence. The hiding place Coleman had chosen demonstrated both his paranoia and his intimate knowledge of Martha's establishment. Behind a false back in the storage room's oldest filing cabinet, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, lay the manila envelope that had waited 23 years for its intended recipient. Hank's name was written across the front in Coleman's distinctive handwriting, but underneath the formal address was a personal note that made his throat tighten with emotion. For my most trusted deputy and the son I never had, may this help you remember who you really are. Inside the envelope, they found documents that reframed everything they thought they knew about Coleman's investigation. The sheriff hadn't just been investigating land fraud. He had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reached into federal agencies, state government, and law enforcement departments across 3 counties. The corruption network was vast, sophisticated, and utterly ruthless in eliminating threats to its operation, but it was the final item in the envelope that delivered the devastating blow that would change everything. Wrapped in tissue paper like a sacred relic was Hank's original deputy badge, its surface bearing scratches and dents that told the story of years of faithful service. But scratched into the metal with crude, desperate strokes were words that made his world collapse around him. I killed Coleman. Forgive me. HC, the badge fell from Hank's nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor of Martha's storage room like an accusation that could no longer be denied. The physical evidence was undeniable. His own badge, bearing his own confession in what appeared to be his own handwriting. All the doubts about his innocence, all the hope that he had been framed rather than guilty, crumbled in the face of this artifact that couldn't be explained away. Dr. Henderson picked up the badge with the careful precision of someone examining evidence at a crime scene. The scratching is fresh, he observed quietly. This wasn't done 23 years ago. Someone added this message recently, probably within the last few weeks. But even as the doctor spoke, memories were flooding back to Hank with the force of a dam bursting. Not the chemically suppressed memories of Coleman's murder, but recent memories that he had somehow blocked from his conscious awareness. He could see himself in his cabin late at night, drinking heavily and staring at the badge with growing horror. He could remember taking his hunting knife and carefully scratching the confession into the metal surface. Driven by guilt and shame that felt as real as the mountain air he breathed, I did it, he whispered, his voice barely audible in the silence of the storage room. Not 23 years ago, but last week. After I found Coleman's body, after I started remembering fragments. I was so drunk I could barely stand, but I remember scratching those words into the badge. I remember believing that I had killed him, the revelation that he had defaced his own badge in a moment of alcohol-fueled. Self-recrimination should have been a relief, proof that the confession was the product of guilt rather than genuine memory. But as more fragments of recent memory surfaced, Hank began to understand the true horror of what had been done to him. The suppressed memories weren't just from 23 years ago. Someone had been systematically manipulating his recollections for years, using a combination of chemical agents and psychological techniques to ensure that he remained convinced of his own guilt. The alcohol he consumed wasn't just an escape from pain, it was a delivery system for drugs that kept his amnesia intact. Martha's sharp intake of breath drew their attention to another document in Coleman's envelope. one that detailed the sheriff's growing awareness of the conspiracy against his own deputy. Coleman had discovered that Hank was being drugged and manipulated, that the young deputy's supposed betrayal was actually evidence of his loyalty being exploited by sophisticated psychological warfare. The letter Coleman had written to accompany the evidence was perhaps the most heartbreaking document any of them had ever read. Hank, if you're reading this, then my fears about what they plan to do to you have come true. You are not the traitor they will make you believe you are. You are the most honest and dedicated lawman I have ever known, which is exactly why they chose you to manipulate. They needed someone close to me, someone I trusted completely, and they found a way to use that trust against both of us. The drugs they've been giving you will make you forget, will make you believe their version of events rather than the truth. But you are innocent of everything except caring too much about justice. When your memory returns, and I pray it will, remember that I never doubted you, never blamed you, and never stopped believing in the man I was proud to call my deputy. The real traitor is someone we both trusted, someone who had access to our investigation and the authority to manipulate evidence. I've hidden the proof in places they'll never think to look, but you'll need to remember who you were before they broke your mind to understand where to find it. Fight for the truth, son. Fight for yourself, and know that whatever they made you do, whatever they made you believe, the blame belongs to them, not you. The letter continued with specific details about the manipulation techniques being used against him, the identity of the real traitor within the sheriff's department, and most importantly, the location of evidence that would prove his innocence and expose the true scope of the conspiracy. But it was the final paragraph that delivered the truth that would reshape everything. The man giving them information isn't someone pretending to be your friend. It's someone who has been your friend, who used that friendship to destroy you. Vincent Shaw Sr. couldn't have succeeded without help from someone you trusted completely, someone who knew your routines, your weaknesses, your absolute dedication to justice. When you remember who that person is, remember also that their betrayal doesn't diminish your worth. You are still the man I was proud to mentor, the deputy who refused to be bought or intimidated. They broke your mind because they couldn't break your spirit. As the full implications of Coleman's message sank in, Hank felt the last pieces of his fractured identity beginning to reassemble. He hadn't been a willing participant in Coleman's murder. He had been a victim, carefully selected and systematically destroyed by people who understood that the most effective weapon against a good man was his own conscience. The badge lying on the floor of Martha's storage room wasn't evidence of his guilt, it was evidence of how completely his enemies had succeeded in breaking him. But Coleman's faith in his character, preserved across 23 years of manipulation and lies, offered something more precious than absolution. It offered hope that the man he had been could be recovered, that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. Outside, the mountain wind carried the sound of approaching vehicles, multiple engines moving with the coordination of a planned operation. Vincent Shaw had grown tired of waiting for Hank's memories to surface naturally. The final confrontation was beginning, and this time there would be nowhere left to run. But as Hank carefully folded Coleman's letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket beside the sheriff's watch, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the quiet confidence of a man who finally knew who he was and what he was fighting for. The truth was worth dying for, and Tom Coleman's faith in him was worth living up to no matter what the cost. The sound of approaching vehicles grew steadily louder, their engines harmonizing in a mechanical symphony that spoke of coordinated purpose rather than coincidental travel. Through Martha's store windows, they could see headlights cutting through the mountain darkness. At least 3 separate vehicles moving with the measured pace of hunters who had cornered their prey, and felt no need to rush the final approach. "Back door," Martha whispered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades learning the escape routes that kept mountain communities safe from unwanted attention. But even as she spoke, The glow of additional headlights appeared behind the building, confirming what they all suspected. Vincent Shaw had brought enough men to ensure that no one would slip away into the forest darkness. Dr. Henderson moved to the front window, and careful to remain hidden behind the display of local crafts and tourist souvenirs that gave Martha's store its harmless facade. 6 men, maybe 7, he reported quietly. Professional movements, coordinated approach. Shaw's not taking any chances this time. Hank felt a strange calm settling over him as he processed the tactical situation. The memories that had been chemically suppressed for decades were returning in fragments, and among them were skills that Vincent Shaw had probably hoped would remain buried forever. Deputy Hank Cartwright had been more than just Coleman's protégé. He had been a combat veteran who understood how to think strategically when cornered, but it was the final item in Coleman's envelope that would provide them with the weapons they needed to survive the night. Wrapped in oilcloth and preserved with the same meticulous care as the letter was a small recording device, the kind used by undercover investigators to capture conversations that subjects would prefer to keep private. Coleman recorded everything, Martha breathed, examining the device with growing understanding. Every meeting with Shaw Sr., every threat, every admission of guilt. The recordings would have been dynamite 23 years ago, but their explosive potential had only increased with time. If Vincent Shaw Sr. had been willing to murder a sheriff to protect his secrets, his son would be equally motivated to eliminate anyone who possessed evidence of the family's criminal legacy. Dr. Henderson's medical expertise proved invaluable as they prepared for the confrontation ahead. From his bag, he produced small vials of medication that could counteract the chemical agents that had been used to suppress Hank's memories. "These will help clear your mind," he explained as Hank accepted the injection with steady hands. But the process might be painful as suppressed memories surface all at once. The effect was almost immediate. As the medication coursed through his system, memories began flooding back with crystalline clarity. He could see Coleman's face the night he was murdered, not as a victim, but as a man who had known exactly what was happening and had chosen to face his death with dignity rather than flee. He could remember his own desperate attempts to save his mentor, the way Shaw Sr.'s men had overpowered him, and most importantly, the moment when they had forced drugs into his system while explaining exactly how they planned to destroy his mind. "They made me watch," he whispered, the horror of the recovered memory almost overwhelming. "Shaw Sr. wanted me to see Coleman die, wanted me to know that I was helpless to stop it. Then they drugged me and spent weeks conditioning me to believe I had been the one who betrayed him. But the returning memories also brought back skills that had been dormant for decades. Tactical awareness, combat training, and most importantly, the ability to read terrain and anticipate enemy movements. The store that had seemed like a trap moments before now revealed itself as a defensive position with multiple advantages. For those who understood how to use them, Martha's intimate knowledge of her own building proved crucial as they developed their defensive strategy. Hidden passages that had been created during Prohibition for smuggling operations, reinforced walls that could stop small arms fire, and sightlines that would allow them to monitor approaching threats while remaining concealed. "The recordings need to reach the outside world," Hank said as they moved Coleman's evidence to a secure location within the store. "Shaw can kill us, but he can't afford to let this information die with us." Dr. Henderson volunteered to attempt an escape through the mountain terrain. He knew as well as any man alive, carrying copies of the most crucial evidence to law enforcement contacts in the state capital. His medical training had given him connections with federal agencies that investigated corruption, and his reputation for integrity would ensure that Coleman's evidence received serious attention. As the doctor prepared to slip out through a hidden exit that led to the old mine tunnels behind the store, the first of Shaw's men reached the front door. Their confident approach suggested they expected to find frightened civilians rather than the tactical situation that was developing inside the building. "Vincent Shaw," a voice called from outside. carrying the kind of authority that came from years of getting what it demanded. "We know you're in there. Come out and we can settle this without anyone getting hurt." The lie was so transparent that it almost made Hank laugh. Shaw's men hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to eliminate the last witnesses to a 23-year-old murder and ensure that their employer's secrets remained buried forever. But Coleman's final letter had contained more than just evidence and explanations. Hidden within its pages were detailed maps of the area around Martha's store, including the locations of additional evidence caches that the sheriff had prepared as insurance against exactly this kind of situation. The old sheriff had been playing a longer game than anyone had realized, setting up a network of hidden proofs that would survive even if he didn't. As Martha guided them through the preparation of their defensive positions, Hank found himself remembering not just the traumatic events of Coleman's murder, but also the years of training and partnership that had preceded it. Coleman had taught him more than law enforcement techniques. He had instilled principles of justice and integrity that no amount of chemical manipulation could completely erase. They're moving to surround the building, Martha reported from her position at the rear window. But they don't know about the tunnels. Eleanor from the library is already spreading word through the community communication network. By morning, half the county will know what's happening here. The community response was something Shaw hadn't anticipated. Mountain people took care of their own, and Martha's decades of service had earned her loyalties that money couldn't buy. Even as Shaw's men tightened their perimeter around the store, pickup trucks were beginning to appear on the surrounding ridges, their occupants armed with hunting rifles and the kind of determination that came from generations of defending their homes against outside threats. But the most important development was taking place inside Hank's own mind as the last of the chemical suppression lifted and his complete memories returned. He could finally understand the scope of what Coleman had discovered, the network of corruption that had infected not just local government, but federal agencies as well. The sheriff's investigation had threatened billions of dollars in illegal profits, and those stakes were high enough to justify any level of violence. Vincent Shaw's voice came through the store's front door again, but this time it carried desperation rather than confidence. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Cartwright. This goes deeper than you know. There are people involved who won't hesitate to eliminate everyone in this building and anyone who tries to help them." The threat was probably accurate, but it also revealed Shaw's growing awareness that his carefully planned operation was spiraling out of control. The arrival of community support had transformed what should have been a simple elimination into a public confrontation that would be impossible to cover. But as the first shots rang out in the mountain darkness, warning, shots fired by Shaw's men to demonstrate their seriousness, Hank felt the last pieces of his fractured identity clicking into place. He wasn't just a broken hermit hiding from his past anymore. He was Deputy Hank Cartwright, protector of justice and heir to Tom Coleman's legacy of integrity. The final letter Coleman had left for him contained one last revelation that would guide him through the battle ahead. The location of evidence that would not only clear his name, but destroy the entire corruption network that had murdered his mentor. But retrieving that evidence would require him to venture into the most dangerous territory of all, the place where Coleman had died, and where Hank's own nightmare had begun. Outside, Shaw's men were closing in for what they expected to be an easy victory. Inside, three unlikely allies prepared to honor the memory of a good man who had died believing that truth and justice would eventually prevail. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either validate Coleman's faith or bury it forever beneath the mountain soil that had already claimed too many secrets. But as Hank checked Coleman's service revolver, the final gift his mentor had left for him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was fighting for. The boy who had been broken and manipulated was gone forever, but the man who remained carried within him everything that Tom Coleman had hoped to preserve. The battle for justice was about to begin. The first real gunshot shattered the mountain silence like thunder breaking across a clear sky, followed immediately by the distinctive crack of return fire from the surrounding ridges where Martha's community allies had positioned themselves. What Vincent Shaw had planned as a quiet elimination had exploded into a full-scale battle that would be heard for miles across the valley. Inside the store, Hank moved with the fluid precision of recovered muscle memory, his body remembering combat skills that 23 years of chemical suppression hadn't been able to completely erase. The layout Martha had shown him transformed into tactical advantages, reinforced walls that could stop rifle rounds, angles of fire that would force attackers into exposed positions, and most importantly, access to the tunnel system that would allow them to control the battlefield. "They're trying to flank us through the alley," Martha called from her position at the rear window, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Years of mountain living had taught her to remain calm under pressure, and her intimate knowledge of the terrain was proving invaluable. But it was the discovery of Coleman's wire recording device that provided them with their most powerful weapon. Hidden within the store's old cash register, exactly where Coleman's letter had indicated, was a compact recording unit that the sheriff had used to document his final confrontations with Vincent Shaw Sr. The device was primitive by modern standards, but its mechanical reliability had preserved 23 years of evidence with crystal clarity. Hank activated the playback function just as Shaw's voice echoed from outside the building, demanding surrender. The contrast between father and son became immediately apparent as Shaw Sr.'s recorded voice filled the store, cold and methodical as he detailed his plans for eliminating the troublesome sheriff and his deputy. "Coleman knows too much," the elder Shaw's voice crackled from the ancient speakers, "and Cartwright is too loyal to be bought. We'll have to break them both, but we need it to look like an internal betrayal. The federal investigation dies if it appears that Coleman's own deputy was feeding us information." The recording continued with devastating specificity, detailing not just the murder plot, but also the sophisticated psychological warfare that would be used to destroy Hank's mind. Shaw Sr. had consulted with experts in chemical interrogation, people who understood how to selectively erase memories while implanting false ones. Outside, the gunfire intensified as Shaw's men realized they were facing organized resistance rather than helpless victims. The mountain community's response had been swift and coordinated, with hunters and ranchers taking positions that commanded the approaches to Martha's store. These weren't professional soldiers, but they knew the terrain intimately and possessed the kind of marksmanship that came from a lifetime of hunting in difficult conditions. Vincent Shaw's increasingly desperate shouts revealed his growing awareness that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. "You're all accessories to murder now. Cartwright killed a sheriff, and anyone who helps him is guilty of harboring a fugitive." But the recording device provided the perfect response to Shaw's accusations. Hank activated the external speakers Martha used for announcing store sales, broadcasting his father's confession across the battlefield with devastating effect. "The Cartwright boy is perfect for our needs," Shaw Sr.'s voice boomed across the mountainside. "He trusts Coleman completely, which means Coleman trusts him. We break that trust, make it look like the deputy betrayed his mentor, and the investigation dies with Coleman's reputation." The effect on Shaw's men was immediate and visible. These weren't hardened criminals willing to kill for abstract profit. They were local hired guns who had been told they were hunting a corrupt cop killer. Learning that their employer was the real murderer shattered their resolve and sent several of them melting away into the forest darkness. But Vincent Shaw himself seemed to draw strength from his exposed position, as if finally being able to abandon all pretense was liberating rather than constraining. "You think that recording changes anything?" he shouted toward the store. "My family built this county. We brought prosperity when there was nothing but wilderness and poverty. The arrogance in his voice triggered another flood of recovered memories for Hank. He could suddenly see the younger Vincent Shaw, barely out of college, watching with cold satisfaction as his father's men destroyed an innocent deputy's mind. The family's corruption hadn't ended with the elder Shaw's death. It had simply evolved, becoming more sophisticated and more deeply entrenched in the local power structure. Through the store windows, Hank could see Shaw moving toward the building with the reckless confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. But the community gunfire was forcing his remaining men to keep their heads down, leaving him increasingly isolated as he approached what he still believed would be an easy victory. Martha's steady voice cut through the chaos with crucial intelligence. "He's carrying something. Looks like a briefcase or document folder. And there's something else. He's not wearing body armor like his men." The observation suggested that Shaw was carrying evidence he considered more valuable than his own protection, possibly documents that would implicate his federal contacts or reveal the full scope of the corruption network. But his lack of tactical gear also indicated dangerous overconfidence, the kind of arrogance that could make him unpredictable in the final confrontation. As Shaw reached the store's front steps, his voice took on the intimate tone of someone who believed he was addressing a beaten enemy. "Come out, Cartwright. Let's finish what my father started 23 years ago." Hank emerged from Martha's store with Coleman's service revolver steady in his hands and 23 years of suppressed rage burning in his chest. The weapon felt familiar despite the decades that had passed, its weight and balance triggering muscle memories that chemical manipulation had failed to completely erase. Vincent Shaw stood 20 feet away, his expensive clothes incongruous against the backdrop of mountain violence, still radiating the arrogance of a man who had never faced real consequences. "You look different," Shaw observed with clinical interest. His head tilted as if examining a fascinating specimen. "The medication Dr. Henderson gave you. It's bringing back all those troublesome memories, isn't it? My father would have been fascinated to see how completely we rebuilt your mind." The casual admission of psychological torture should have triggered rage, but instead, Hank felt the cold clarity that had made him an effective deputy before his world was shattered. Shaw's overconfidence was revealing crucial information about the scope of the conspiracy and the identity of additional conspirators. "Your father made one crucial mistake," Hank replied, his voice carrying the authority of a lawman rather than the uncertainty of a broken hermit. He underestimated Tom Coleman's ability to plan for betrayal. Shaw's expression flickered with the first hint of genuine concern. "Coleman's dead. Whatever evidence he thought he preserved died with him." But Hank was already moving, using the tactical skills that had returned with his memories to close the distance between them, while staying out of the line of fire from Shaw's remaining men. The briefcase Shaw carried was indeed crucial through its partially open flap. Hank could see federal identification documents and what appeared to be communications with government contacts. "Coleman knew you were coming for him," Hank continued, circling Shaw with predatory patience. "He knew because someone in the sheriff's department was feeding your father information. But it wasn't me." The realization that had been building throughout the investigation finally crystallized as Hank saw Shaw's reaction to the implied accusation. The real traitor hadn't been Deputy Hank Cartwright. It had been someone with the authority to manipulate evidence and access to both Coleman's investigation and Hank's personal information. "Sheriff Brennan," Hank said, the name emerging from recovered memories like a puzzle piece clicking into place. "Coleman's own undersheriff, the man who would inherit his position if something happened to him." Shaw's involuntary flinch confirmed what the returned memories were telling him. Undersheriff Mike Brennan had been the Shaw family's inside source, feeding them intelligence about Coleman's investigation while positioning himself to benefit from his mentor's elimination. The man who had helped investigate Coleman's disappearance had been the one who orchestrated it. "Brennan's been dead for 15 years, Shaw said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Heart attack." Very sad. The euphemistic description triggered another flood of memories. Hank could suddenly see Brennan's face the night Coleman was murdered, could remember the undersheriff's presence during the psychological conditioning that had destroyed his mind. But he could also remember something else: Coleman's growing suspicions about his second-in-command. The subtle tests the sheriff had begun conducting to verify his subordinate's loyalty. Coleman figured it out, Hank realized, his voice gaining strength as the pieces fell into place. He knew Brennan was the leak. That's why he used me as bait. The truth was both heartbreaking and liberating. Coleman hadn't trusted his deputy to handle the investigation alone. He had deliberately used Hank's obvious loyalty and integrity to force Brennan into revealing himself. The young deputy's genuine reactions and unshakable honesty had made him the perfect test of his superior's loyalty. But Shaw was growing tired of the conversation, his hand moving toward a concealed weapon with the confidence of someone who had eliminated troublesome problems before. "This has been educational, but I have a schedule to maintain. Federal contacts don't like to be kept waiting." The revelation that Shaw was still actively working with federal accomplices transformed the immediate situation into something far more dangerous than a local corruption case. This wasn't just about covering up old crimes. It was about protecting an ongoing operation that reached into government agencies at the highest levels. Coleman's service revolver spoke with the authority of justice, delayed but not denied, its report echoing across the mountain valley like thunder, announcing the arrival of a long-promised storm. Shaw's expression shifted from arrogance to surprise to something approaching understanding as he realized that some debts could never be negotiated away. But even as Shaw fell, his briefcase spilling federal documents and contact information across the mountain soil, Hank knew that the victory was incomplete. The network that had murdered Tom Coleman and destroyed his deputy's mind was larger and more entrenched than either of them had realized 23 years ago. Buster's bark from the direction of the store drew Hank's attention to approaching sirens, multiple vehicles moving fast along the mountain roads. But whether they carried reinforcements for Shaw's operation or legitimate law enforcement, responding to reports of gunfire remained to be seen as Hank knelt beside Shaw's body and gathered the scattered federal documents. He felt the weight of Coleman's watch in his pocket, its stop time finally ready to resume counting toward justice. The immediate threat was ended, but the investigation that had cost so many lives was just beginning to reveal its true scope. The mountain wind carried the scent of approaching rain, washing the air clean in preparation for whatever revelations the coming dawn would bring. 3 months later, Hank stood beside a granite headstone that bore Tom Coleman's name and the inscription, "Sheriff, Mentor, Friend, Justice Delayed is Not Justice Denied." The memorial service had drawn people from across the mountain region, law enforcement officers who remembered Coleman's integrity, community members who had benefited from his protection, and federal investigators who were still unraveling the corruption network that his death had helped expose. The new memorial stone represented more than just proper recognition for a murdered sheriff. It symbolized the restoration of truth that had taken 23 years to achieve. The federal investigation sparked by Vincent Shaw's documents had revealed corruption reaching into agencies at the highest levels, validating Coleman's belief that some secrets were worth dying to expose. Dr. Henderson approached across the cemetery grounds, his medical bag replaced by a folder containing the final reports from the federal task force that had spent months following the evidence trails Coleman and Hank had preserved. "The last of Brennan's federal contacts was arrested this morning," he reported with quiet satisfaction. "The network that killed Tom is finally completely dismantled." The investigation had revealed the staggering scope of the conspiracy Coleman had died trying to expose. What had appeared to be simple land fraud had actually been part of a systematic effort to acquire strategic properties for development projects that violated environmental protections, involved illegal government contracts, and generated profits that were shared with federal officials who ensured that investigations were buried or misdirected. Martha joined them at the gravesite, her arms full of wildflowers that she began arranging around the headstone's base. Ildenor says the Historical Society wants to create a permanent exhibit about Tom's investigation, she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had helped preserve crucial truth. They want to make sure future generations understand the price of integrity. The community response to the truth had been both heartwarming and sobering. Many residents had suspected corruption over the years, but had lacked the evidence or authority to challenge powerful interests. Coleman's vindication had inspired a new commitment to transparency in local government, though it had also revealed how easily democratic institutions could be subverted by determined criminals. But it was Buster's presence at the memorial that provided the most poignant reminder of how the truth had finally emerged. The dog sat alert beside Hank, his loyalty unwavering despite the chaos and violence that had marked their transition from isolation to community involvement. His persistent barking at the burial site had triggered a chain of events that restored justice to a situation that many had assumed would remain forever buried. Hank's own transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic result of the investigation. The broken hermit who had fled to the mountains to escape unbearable guilt had been replaced by a man who understood his true worth and the value of the principles Tom Coleman had tried to instill in him. The chemical manipulation that had stolen years of his life couldn't be undone, but its effects had been overcome by the power of truth and the support of people who believed in justice. The Federal Witness Protection Program had offered him a new identity and relocation assistance, but Hank had chosen to remain in the mountains that had sheltered him during his darkest years. The cabin that had been a refuge from painful memories had become a base for helping other victims of corruption and psychological manipulation, working with Dr. Henderson to develop treatments for trauma-induced amnesia and chemical memory suppression. Martha's general store had become an unofficial headquarters for a network of community watchdog groups that monitored government activities and preserved evidence of potential corruption. The lessons learned from Coleman's investigation had created a new awareness of the importance of citizen involvement in protecting democratic institutions, but perhaps the most important change was in Hank's relationship with his own past. The guilt and shame that had driven him to isolation had been replaced by understanding and purpose. He was no longer running from the man he had been. He was building on the foundation that Tom Coleman had helped establish, using his recovered skills and knowledge to protect others who might face similar threats. The afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the mountain peaks as the memorial service concluded, painting the cemetery in shades of gold that seemed appropriate for honoring a man whose integrity had shone brightly, even in the darkest circumstances. As the crowd began to disperse, Hank remained beside Coleman's grave, pulling the sheriff's watch from his pocket and setting its hands to the correct time. The watch had stopped at the moment of Coleman's death, but its resumption of normal function symbolized the restoration of justice and the continuation of the principles the sheriff had died defending. Time had not diminished the value of truth or the importance of standing up for what was right, even when the cost seemed unbearable. Dr. Henderson's final medical examinations had confirmed that Hank's memory had been fully restored, though the scars left by years of chemical manipulation would never completely heal. But those scars had become sources of strength rather than shame, reminders of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of truth to overcome even the most sophisticated deceptions. As Hank walked back toward his truck, Buster at his side, and Martha waiting with the patience of someone who understood that some moments required solitude, he felt a peace that had been absent from his life for decades. The mountains that surrounded Silver Ridge no longer felt like a prison or a hiding place. They felt like home, a sanctuary where justice had finally been served and where good people could build something better from the ashes of corruption. The past had been reconciled, the present was full of purpose, and the future held the promise of continued service to principles that Tom Coleman would have been proud to see flourishing. Some stories ended with dramatic victories, but the best ones continued with quiet dedication to making sure that such victories endured. The watch in Hank's pocket ticked steadily onward, counting time toward whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that truth was worth whatever price it demanded.